Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 26. And my guest in this episode is Dr. Matthew David Segall, and Matthew is an assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, California. And I brought Matthew onto the show to discuss his new book that was released last year called Physics of the World's Soul. And within the book, Matthew does an incredible job of essentially decoding Whitehead's adventure in cosmology, or his metaphysics, and he also gives some background on what influenced Whitehead, and so it's an excellent read, and I very much enjoyed reading it. It is accessible, and it might be argued that Whitehead's metaphysics, by way of his books, can be a bit less accessible. So Matthew has done an incredible job, not only in this book, but in the work he does on his YouTube channel and his website. So I very much enjoyed this conversation. It was informative and enlightening, and it was also very much accessible if this is an introduction to Whitehead for you. So please join Matthew and myself in this conversation as obviously the passive observer, and I hope you enjoy it and get out of it what I got out of it, which was quite a bit. So thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the conversation. And I'd like to introduce Professor Matthew Segall to the IdeaCast interview series. Matthew, welcome. I'm so grateful to have you on this call. You're going to quench a thirst today with my questions and my curiosity about the work that you do. So I'm happy to have you here. I'm also excited to talk about your book, Physics of the World's Soul. That's probably the prime reason I reached out to you, was to get that book on my show. And so welcome. I'm so glad to have you on board.
Appreciate the invitation, Justin, and looking forward to the conversation.
As am I. So as with any good interview, let's go ahead and start with a background, if you will, and we'll talk about you first. And I'm curious to know a little about you with regard to your inclination towards philosophy and what brought you to where you are in your life right now.
Well, I was blessed to have a really wonderful teacher in high school, and to have the opportunity to take a couple of courses in philosophy in high school. It was a public school, but I took a course in Eastern and Western philosophy with a teacher named Mr. Ennis, or Kai Ennis, and he introduced me to the three most important thinkers for me as a 17-year-old were Alan Watts, Carl Jung, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who didn't understand very well at the time, but nonetheless, Nietzsche has this really fiery way of writing that inspires people in their late teens, and there's much more depth there that you can continue to study as you mature. But nonetheless, it was these three thinkers that sort of kindled the philosophic flame in me, and I knew immediately that I was either going to become a psychologist or a teacher, because I just couldn't see any other avenues for pursuing this quest to understand and make meaning, and to participate with others in that quest. And so I ended up going to get my undergraduate degree at the University of Central Florida, and I started actually as a journalism major. Journalist was another possibility, but I quickly switched to psychology, and then I ended up in philosophy, and finally graduated with a degree in cognitive science. And so I really wanted to study consciousness, and was looking for graduate programs. I considered staying at the University of Central Florida to study with Sean Gallagher, who's a cognitive scientist and phenomenological philosopher, sort of in the tradition of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, studying the way that experience is embodied, challenging some of the computationalist approaches to understanding the nature of cognition and consciousness. And so I considered staying there to study with Professor Gallagher, but ended up discovering this school in San Francisco uh, the California Institute of Integral Studies. Alan Watts was the first dean when this school
Okay.
started in the late 50s. It was called the American Academy of Asian Studies at the time. Anyways, I ended up staying there for my PhD, and now I teach there.
Uh-huh.
And it was only at CIIS that I first studied Whitehead in an academic context, though I had been hearing his name dropped frequently as I was sort of pursuing this trail of books as an undergraduate, trying to deepen my understanding of consciousness and its place in the universe. And Whitehead's name kept coming up, but I was always warned, you know, don't don't study him alone or outside the context of a learning community or an expert in his thought, because you will drown
Mm.
in the abstraction and the difficulty of his scheme and the new words that he's inventing. And so I waited till grad school, and my formal introduction came through studying with Professor Eric Weiss, who passed away last year. And so he introduced me to Whitehead's works and to the importance of Whitehead's contribution to the philosophy of science. And so I haven't looked back. I've been studying Whitehead since 2008, and really, it's continued. My study has continued to intensify over the last 13, 14 years or so, because he's just so deep.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah, that's kind of how I got here.
Well, that's a heck of a story, and he does take on a lot, and so we'll go through that in our conversation. So prior to getting out to San Francisco, um, could you say what your position might have been in terms of the 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 big story of consciousness? Where were you coming from when you arrived before Whitehead influenced you, or before even was German ideology part of your teaching out there, or was there some of that on board already before you moved out from UCF, or
So
idealism in general? I'm
German
sorry.
idealism, yeah. That also came to me in graduate school. When I was an undergraduate, I was very influenced by this sort of mythology surrounding the 1960s counterculture
Okay.
and, the influx of Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, Vedanta, all these things.
Mhm.
And I was very interested in philosophy and Western philosophy, but sort of, as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, had this sort of critique of what I perceived to be the dominant approach in Western philosophy, coming from a more sort of Buddhist perspective, which was, the real goal here is awakening or satori or enlightenment,
Mhm.
which isn't necessarily knowing the answers to all the philosophical questions, but rather, um, as Buddha would say, having relieved oneself of the craving which causes suffering, you
Mhm.
know?
Mhm.
And so I haven't, I don't think you can grow out of or beyond that. That's a profound sense
Yeah,
of,
good place to start, right?
yeah. But I've come to a deeper appreciation of the Western philosophical lineage, and realized that there's a sort of heterodox, esoteric stream that runs through the West that's no less profound and deep as the sort of Asian forms of
Mhm.
spirituality and mysticism that I was learning about. And so I've kind of come full circle and returned to what would be, like my own indigenous tradition,
Right.
um, and deepened into that study in graduate school and continuing it um, now as a professor. And so, yeah, I think it's not that my earlier appreciation for the importance of, what scholars would call soteriology, which is
Mhm.
a fancy word for the study of like salvation, basically.
Right,
As
right.
that's sort of the Christian term for it. In
Uh-huh.
the Buddhist sense, it would be,
The
awakening.
release, right. Okay.
And so that's still absolutely essential to, how I view philosophy is as itself a kind of spiritual practice.
Okay.
As Socrates said, philosophy is learning to die.
Mhm.
the philosopher is in a way preparing themselves for death, and that is, I think, a spiritual practice. Spiritual practice, and philosophy is asking the big questions. Trying to understand how all the special sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, how do these relate to one another? How do they hang together as a whole? What is the nature of the universe within which all of these domains that science studies, uh, find their place? And so I'm very interested in these intellectual challenges as much as I am in the sort of spiritual motivations that interested me more especially as a teenager. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So it's a good marriage or a synthesis of those two
Right.
brackets or disciplines, bracketed disciplines rather, seemingly bracket. But like as you said, I've recently turned my focus to our Western tradition and seeking insights from there. And so early Christian mysticism, especially 12th, 13th, 14th century, seems to be really ripe with possibly derivatives of Neoplatonism, but also, mixed in with other things, including the Trinity narrative and so forth. So it's fascinating, as well as Sufism, which is sort of bridging East and West. But I just get more and more fascinated by that, not only that time period, but maybe it's the Silk Road things that were going on, and just the sharing of so much information. And a lot of that, again, was carried further west, I think, from my feeble apprehension of history and how both mysticism and early philosophy came to take seat in that area and then percolate up to something else. So yeah, we have a richness in the West, and I think it is overshadowed by probably the luster of, or the grandiose nature of Advaita Vedanta and Shankara and Ramanuja and all those things that you can, and I think they're essential too. But we have a lot here that we can work with and work over. At least that's my view. That's what I can see, I guess, from it.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, you mentioned the Silk Road, and in some sense, East met West thousands of years ago. It didn't just happen, in the 50s and 60s in San Francisco or
right.
California.
The hippie trail.
Yeah. In many ways, the Western philosophy was already sort of permeated by, these Asian and African even forms of wisdom. Plato was influenced by the Egyptians, and some say through Pythagoras. There was also Indian and Vedic streams of thought flowing in, and so the West isn't some pure
vacuum
self-invention of philosophy. There were already these important influences from elsewhere.
Sure. Yeah, and I did touch base with some of the pre-Socratic Greeks, and I jokingly call myself a neo-Pyrrhonius, a Pyrrhonist or a whatever Pyrrhonist, that would be. Yeah, Pyrrhonist, a quasi-Pyrrhonist, and so in looking into the work of Sextus Empiricus and that little camp, that was informed by India and the schools there, and so yeah, there's a nice Creole being formed over centuries. And working and they seem to have gotten along well, right? So the boundaries were open culturally and probably politically to a degree. I mean, there was always fighting and stuff for power, but I think the wise people, the scholars, and the sages and so forth were able to communicate with each other and argue, but reasonably and healthily. And so again, bringing that back to the West was a gift to us for sure. So let's move up, I guess. Where do you want to do? So we want to move into introducing your book and Whitehead. And do we start with Descartes to Spinoza to Kant, or do you want to start maybe from Kant and go forward, or how would you like to set that up to introduce Alfred North Whitehead to us?
Oh yeah, well, modern philosophy is typically said to begin with Descartes, and in Whitehead's magnum opus, Process and Reality, he actually says in the preface that he found it necessary to recur to pre-Kantian modes of philosophy,
Okay.
Particularly Descartes and Hume and Locke, and Berkeley, and he talks a lot about Kant as well, but he feels like Kant sort of pushed thought in the wrong direction.
Mm.
Even if Kant himself, who Whitehead respects deeply, because he was both a great philosopher and had a deep understanding of Newtonian physics and mathematics, and Whitehead thinks that Kant, though, started this tradition of idealism, transcendental idealism, where the next generation, with some important exceptions, tended to lose touch with science and mathematics, natural science, and that worried Whitehead. Whitehead didn't seem to recognize the extent to which an important German idealist philosopher, Friedrich Shelling, actually remained in close touch with the sciences of his day.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Like biology was just coming into its own as a proper science. This would have been in like the late 1790s, early 1800s, and Schelling developed this whole philosophy of nature that I feel like is a precursor to Whitehead, but Whitehead just wasn't that familiar with Schelling because not much of Schelling's work was translated. I mean, the American transcendentalists were very interested in Schelling in like the 1840s and 50s, but then transcendentalism fell out of favor as sort of positivism and materialism rose. And so, Whitehead just didn't have a chance to get to know Schelling too much, but Whitehead's inheriting this whole tradition of philosophy, going back to Plato, but particularly these early modern figures. And he's sort of, one of the things that happened in modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes, was this, what we could call the turn toward the subject, towards subjectivity, and consciousness as like the key site for philosophizing, right? Basically, modern philosophy became the philosophy of consciousness because nature was just given over to science, right? This new scientific method with precise measurement and mathematical calculation. It's like for several centuries, the philosophers just sort of let the scientists have nature, and they focused on consciousness, which is a function of the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Whitehead recognizes the importance of deep inquiry into the nature of subjectivity, but he really begins his philosophical work, which is like his second career. He starts as a mathematician and mathematical physicist.
Okay.
But then after he retires from that, he starts his philosophical career critiquing what he called the bifurcation of nature.
Okay.
Which is another way of thinking about the Cartesian dualism. It's not exactly the same as what Descartes meant, but it's similar. Whitehead's account of the bifurcation of nature was such that there were the primary characteristics like the dimensionality of physical objects, the mass, anything that could be quantified and measured was considered, since the time of Galileo and Descartes, the primary characteristics of the material world of nature. And then on the other hand were these so-called secondary characteristics, which are colors and tastes and all the qualitative things that are added, it was thought, by the subject to what's really there physically, which can be measured and weighed and so on. And Whitehead felt like this bifurcation was incoherent, and it leads to all sorts of confusions when we try to integrate the knowledge that science gives us of that external world in quantitative terms with what we experience most immediately and intimately as conscious animals. Namely, we have a sense of purpose and value and agency, and we experience the beauty of a sunset, right? Not just we don't perceive the electric waves and the sorry about that loud noise.
It's okay. It's not bleeding over too bad, so
Okay.
You're good.
We don't perceive the electric waves that the physicist is describing.
Right.
We perceive redness, right? And all the other beautiful hues that make up our experience of a sunset. And so Whitehead wanted to bring these two back together. And he realized that to do this, he was going to need to articulate a whole new set of categories that weren't the Cartesian categories, that weren't, the Kantian categories. And that's why he's inventing all these new words, because he really wants to provide us with a new language that totally refigures and allows us to reimagine what it means to be a conscious being in the context of an evolving universe, right? And I tried to introduce people with some degree of philosophical background to the novelty of Whitehead's thought in my book, and it's almost like a refounding of philosophy. And if Whitehead achieves his goal, 100 years from now, people will look back, and just as we look to Descartes as the founder of modern philosophy, we could look to Whitehead and other important thinkers too as sort of founding a new kind of philosophy, what we could call the philosophy of organism. That's what Whitehead called it, replacing the Cartesian philosophy of mechanism.
Okay. And his attempt to reunite that or suture back that bifurcation, I don't know if we should talk about this later, but so present day, I'm seeing it batted about a lot more than maybe 5 years ago. So I maybe started getting into philosophy about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I didn't have my net out too wide, but lately I hear Whiteheadian thinking. So before, like 5 years ago, it was the Cobb Institute, and there was you, and there was a few other people talking about it. There's a couple of PhD students that were working with Whitehead, but it seems to be working its way in, I guess. So we have Ian McGilchrist and Peter Shusted Hughes that are talking about it. Just two good examples. I know Sheldrake is warm to it to a degree. He has his own thing going with morphic resonance and his idea of the Trinity, but he in his conversations, with Mark Vernon seem to enfold that as an allied thought with what they talk about. So I'm hopeful that this kind of thinking will flourish and continue to grow, especially, and this again is something I do want to cover with you, as you and others are trying to sort of put out a good counterpoint to, or an alternative, or however you want to frame it, to the physicalist narrative and to some of the derivatives of physicalist thinking that are sometimes unconscious, and they get into the sort of the mainstream, the media, and the psyche of the average person. Right. So again, I'm sort of pointing in the direction of nihilism and vapid consumerism and things like that. If we have this sort of view of life and reality as being nothing but billiard balls bouncing off each other and things like that, and that we're very happenstantial. So this is where I find work like yours and others to be of tremendous value in this day and age. So sorry, I rambled. I told you sometimes I ramble, but to get to a point, I think Whitehead is critical at this time. I'll sum it up that way.
Yeah,
it's
I
not
agree, and I've noticed also the increase in popularity of some of his ideas, and his name's getting dropped a lot more frequently. So his philosophy when he was writing in the mid 1920s through the late 30s, philosophy was moving in a very different direction, and so he was kind of unseasonable. And his thought was only kept alive by the theologians, the process theologians, for the most part, for several decades, including the folks down at Claremont Graduate University and the Center for Process Studies. And they did great work to try to keep alive the dialogues with with scientists and with other psychologists and other people in the humanities. But now it's like Whitehead's sort of, the cat's out of the bag, and he's being picked up by people for all sorts of different projects. And it's an exciting time. Yeah, because I think, as you're saying, there's sort of academic philosophy and the problems that it's trying to figure out, but then there's the broader worldview implications of the sorts of ideas that come out of the university. And now with the internet, we're in an age where knowledge is not controlled by universities, knowledge production, right? There are independent scholars who are able to, refine and articulate their ideas in the public sphere uh, outside of an academic context. And, things are really starting to become very dynamic. And
Mm-hmm.
I think Whitehead's thought is well suited to the sorts of problems our world is facing now, and they help address this nihilistic malaise that's sort of infecting us because of let's face it, early signs, at least, of the collapse of our civilization. And so we're looking for new sources of meaning and
Yeah.
new orientations to, a different kind of world, right? And I think philosophy has a role to play in shaping our worldviews, right? It's not just about solving academic puzzles, but it's about helping us figure out how to lead meaningful lives. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of resources in Whitehead's Cosmology for that.
Yeah, making available new cultural normatives and ideas for sure. And we'll hope that I should say we. But anyway, I interview people that are doing this, and so that you all are arriving on time and producing um, ideas, thoughts, and making them available to the world to be picked up and to be used, and secondarily to non-academics, so they can enter into a more casual conversation or casual apprehension of this kind of thinking. And again, that's when we talked before I hit record. That's the spirit of what I try to do, is to make things accessible and palatable for folks like myself. That we're not that disciplined, or we're smart, but we need just a little bit of that. What's the right word? Processing, I guess, to make it happen for ourselves. So I guess, why don't we bring Whitehead in, and if you want to do a little background on Whitehead, and then we can maybe go into sort of the real meat of his metaphysics. We'll talk about that, and we'll have you explicate the details again to a palatable or accessible degree, and then let's talk about the implications going forward. We just kind of touched on that a little bit, but then we'll go back and revisit that. So Alfred North Whitehead.
Yeah, he was initially a star. The first notable thing about him was that he was a star rugby player in high school, and went to Cambridge University, Trinity College, and was quite gifted at mathematics, and quickly became a professor at Cambridge, teaching math for. He was there for nearly 25 years. His most famous student was Bertrand Russell, and they collaborated on this set of three volumes called the Principia Mathematica, which was an attempt to ground mathematics or arithmetic in particular, in logic, and to basically prove logically that 1 + 1 does indeed equal 2.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of intuitive, since Kant articulated it, there's an intuitive dimension to mathematics, and they wanted to make mathematics a formal, logical science, as it were.
Okay.
So that it was just deduction and no need for this intuitive constructive element. The project failed, at least to deliver on providing a logical foundation for mathematics. But the methods that they developed in pursuit of that goal were really, really important for the development of analytic philosophy and symbolic logic, and in some respects, computers, because without this appreciation for the power of symbolic logic, it's not clear that we would have been able to develop computation and the sorts of technologies that have totally transformed the world.
Okay.
But so this 3 volumes was published between, I think, 1910 and 1912 or 13. Right around this time, Einstein was starting to become more well known. He's publishing his special papers on the special theory in 1905, and 1915 his papers on the general theory. And Whitehead's one of the few mathematicians, mathematical physicists who can understand these esoteric new mathematical and geometric approaches to studying space and space-time. And so this is starting to draw Whitehead into metaphysical questions. What is space, and what is time?
Mm-hmm.
What is matter and energy? What is the observer, such that we would need to begin factoring in the role that the observer plays in making measurements of space and time. Galileo already had some sense of the relativity at play here, but Einstein really revolutionizes the role that the observer plays in the context of scientific measurement. And then it was also at this time, quantum theory was being articulated.
Okay.
And so Whitehead's hip to all of these new developments. And, he actually studied with one of James Clerk Maxwell's students. So he's one removed from Maxwell, who develops the equations for electromagnetism, and which was already kind of didn't fit well with the Newtonian mechanistic worldview.
Okay.
The notion of light as a wave of some kind. Newton didn't imagine that. He was aware of that possibility already, but it didn't fit with his understanding of an atomistic
right. Doesn't seem intuitive.
universe.
Yeah.
And so Whitehead already had some sense that the Newtonian worldview was incomplete from his study of electromagnetism. But then with quantum and relativity theories, obviously, we need a new metaphysical context or foundation for what natural science, physics in particular, is revealing about the universe. And so Whitehead began in 1919. He wrote a book called Principles of Natural Knowledge, which starts to grapple with some of the epistemological implications of Einstein's discoveries. 1920, he wrote a book called The Concept of Nature, which was really kind of what put him on the map as an important philosopher. The French philosopher Bergson read this book and thought very highly of it. And then 1922, Whitehead actually articulates his own theory of relativity, of gravitation, that was an alternative rendering of Einsteinian relativity that didn't require the notion of curved space, which for technical reasons Whitehead was worried made measurement impossible. If your ruler warps because of mass arrayed in the universe, it becomes difficult to justify interstellar measurements. Because, in short, you don't know where the masses are until you've measured, but you can't trust your measurements because you don't know where the masses are. So you're in a situation where, as Whitehead put it, you need to know everything before you can know anything.
Okay.
And so he had an epistemological critique of the way Einstein was interpreting his theory. He articulated his own tensor equations and mathematical rendering of relativity, which was empirically equivalent to Einstein's equations. Again, not relying on the idea of curved space. More recently, some physicists have argued that more sensitive measurements have shown that Einstein's version holds up better, but there are ways to adjust Whitehead's version of it to bring it back into alignment with empirical findings. And so ongoing controversy among physicists. Anyways, these three books I just mentioned from 1919 to 1922 is, Whitehead beginning to develop his own philosophy of nature, you could say, and philosophy of science. And then in 1924, he was invited to Harvard to take up a post in their philosophy department. And there he begins to do metaphysics proper and cosmology proper for the first time. 1925, he published a book called Science and the Modern World, which looks at the history of the scientific revolution, its sort of sociological causes, and then he also begins to develop his what he would call philosophy of organism, interpreting quantum and relativity theories in light of this new metaphysical framework that he's developing. A number of smaller books were published, like Symbolism, his account of like human language and perception, and another book called The Function of Reason that talks kind of about evolution and how rational animals could have evolved out of nature. And then in 1929, which was initially his Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, Process and Reality is published. His most important book. He lays out the whole system there. And then 1933, he published Adventures of Ideas, and 1938, Modes of Thought. So these are sort of his big philosophical works. He retired from Harvard in 1938 as well, and then died in 1947. He wrote a few short essays after retiring. Mathematics and the Good is a great one, and one on immortality, where he sort of tries to, late in life, envision what his philosophical scheme might portend for an afterlife.
Okay.
Spoiler warning, he doesn't know
what happened. Well, there you go.
Yeah. Back so to that's kind of his trajectory, yeah.
Okay. And that's interesting. It follows, the last piece seems to follow what would be of import to you at various stages of your life. So, we're in our phase of what's going on and then where do I go, right? Mm-hmm. So, and in listening to your lectures, I know that, and you had brought these names up before, Shelling being an important influence, William James being an important influence. And I believe from your lectures, you note that James is well known for his radical empiricism, and that shows up to a degree in Whitehead's scheme. And so can we go ahead and just take that dive into the pool of his metaphysics, and we'll unpack it and talk about it for a little bit, and then, like I said, maybe we'll move on from there and see what the implications are for that.
Yeah, definitely. So from James, Whitehead inherits this sense for the importance of experience.
Okay.
And James is a philosopher, but kind of really grounded in psychology, and developed a psychological account of the nature of experience. James called it, the stream of thought, or the stream of consciousness. This notion of a flowing, sort of organic fluidity to the nature of experience, and wanted to overcome this Cartesian dualism between mind and matter, and instead describe reality from a psychological point of view as a continuum of experience. And so, there are obviously experiences of things that seem to be kind of external to us and more material, and then there are other experiences that seem to be more internal to us and mental. But for James, what is finally real is this plenum of what he called pure experience, right? And subjectivity and objectivity emerge as sort of different modes of experience within this continuum. Whitehead takes James's psychology and tries to expand it or generalize it into a whole cosmology. James was already flirting with what's called panpsychism. The idea that consciousness or mind doesn't emerge out of matter at some point in evolutionary history when matter forms neurons with enough connections that poof, all of a sudden you get mind. James thought that didn't make sense, and that evolution actually makes a lot more sense if there's some germ of mentality in matter already, which is in some ways driving matter to organize itself and complexify. So Whitehead really runs with this idea, and sees experience as pervasive in the natural world, and develops an account of temporal becoming that is consistent, he felt, with electromagnetism, with quantum theory, which is the idea that energy comes in quanta, right? Like buds of or pulses of energy, and that there's not this sense of simple continuity in nature. You know, electron shells come at certain energy levels, and there's nothing in between. You have to leap from one to the other if you're an electron, and so this kind of was in tension with James's sense of just this continuity. Bergson also thought more in terms of continuity of process. Whitehead brings back a kind of atomism, but it is an atomism of experiential drops or pulses that are internally related to one another, which means that Whitehead's atoms are not isolated, separate bits of matter that just blindly bump into other atoms. They are experiential points of view, and what it means to be an experiential point of view is to have inherited a past and achieved a new subjective uh, point of view on that past. And then, as soon as that point of view is achieved, it too perishes and becomes part of the environment that is inherited by the next pulse of experience. And so, in this way, each atom of experience, if you want, internalizes the entire past universe and adds itself to the universe, right? So that there's this process of growth through the evolution of the universe that is almost like cellular. So instead of talking about atoms of experience, we could just call them cells. And in many respects, Whitehead's trying to make biology or the study of organisms the more general science
Mm.
than physics,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And so this is why he calls it the philosophy of organism.
Mm.
So that's sort of, I think, the best way to introduce the novelty of his conception of reality, which is that it's composed of this network of actual occasions. He referred to them as actual occasions of experience, which are like constantly sort of budding or growing out of the past uh, and launching themselves into the future. And it's not just an inheritance of the past, though. I should mention that even though he was a process philosopher, he made reference to this realm of possibilities or potentials. He called them eternal objects. They're kind of like Platonic forms, like the universals that can characterize any particular experience. Like you could have a red stop sign or a red apple or a red bird, but a red robin. But redness itself isn't just limited to any of its particular instantiations, right? It's
Okay.
an eternal object and it participates in different particulars. And Whitehead thought he needed to make reference to this realm to account for the novelty that we see in the course of history and evolution. So when each drop of experience is inheriting its past, depending on the complexity of its situation, say if it's in a human brain and an experience is forming, it's not only inheriting the just prior state of the brain and the surrounding environment, it's also ingressing, is Whitehead's term,
Mhm.
possibilities that have never been realized before in the history of the universe.
Okay.
And it ingresses those possibilities so as to give a new interpretation of what is being inherited from the past. So through these ingressions of possibilities, novelty is introduced into the course of evolution. And once a new idea has been ingressed, it can then be inherited by the next moment. So it's, in a way, it becomes canalized, or it becomes a new part of the already actualized universe that then helps to shape what happens next,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Yeah,
And that's where you say the many become one and then are increased by one, right? Which is a good way to summarize part of what's going on there
exactly. I
with
didn't
the.
use the word concrescence yet, but this is a
Yeah.
key term
Right.
in Whitehead's metaphysics, which he defines quite simply as, yeah, the process whereby the many objects of the perished past grow together into a novel unity, which itself perishes to become part of the many. And this
Mm.
process is iterative, it repeats, and it's cumulative, right? Because each new moment of experience is including um, all the experiences which have just perished. And so, it's not just repeating the past, it's cumulative in the sense that it's growing, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's including and transcending what has just occurred.
And I think he's careful to make note that, I believe in your lectures you mentioned the Rock of Edinburgh where the castle is, and that so that what we would call inanimate substance is it is essentially reiterating that process, but then let's just say metabolizing biological agents like ourselves and the myriad other there's novelty in that, right? There's a freshness in that sense. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So rocks or inanimate objects, including human artifacts or architecture, it's uh, highly repetitive,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's still full of these drops of experience, but they're mostly just repeating what just happened.
Stable.
Right. Only in more complex forms of organization, like living organisms, do you get this capacity to ingress novelty such that you can't predict, what an animal will do in the next moment,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that you can predict what a rock will do if you drop it, you know?
Right, right.
Mhm.
If you're game, I can pull up the animation. I will try. If the Zoom gods are favoring me right now, I will uh, aspire to do that. Now, I'm going to collapse my Zoom screen for just a second, pull up the right tab,
Yep.
and then reset the animation because Matthew has a wonderful animation, and you will have access to his YouTube channel and all relevant links at the bottom in the description field of this. So I'm sorry to have live television going on here, but I want to. All right, let me see if I can share what's going on here. And there's no sound to this clip, so I don't need to worry about that. Okay, Matthew, if you can confirm that that's up.
Yep. I
Okay,
see it.
perfect. So let's run that for the audience. And this is a wonderful PowerPoint or animation. So I'll shut up here.
Yeah. So I chose daffodils to sort of uh, exemplify the process of concrescence because it's a very organic process that moves from roots to budding flowers, you could say.
Okay.
So every concrescence has a physical pole and a mental pole. So rather than separate substances, the physical and the mental become poles in a process, a dipolar process, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the objects in the past in the environment streaming into and being prehended, is Whitehead's word,
Okay.
by a newly concressing occasion of experience, initially felt by the physical pole, and then in the mental pole are ingressed these pure potentials or eternal objects that help this concrescence characterize what it's experiencing in its physical pole. The subjective form is how it feels to receive the past, and then there's also a subjective aim, which is what's drawing the many different objects of the past together towards their satisfaction, which is this novel unity, which is achieved by the concrescence. And as soon as that new subjective perspective is achieved, it perishes and becomes what Whitehead calls a superject, right? Which is a novel unit of value emergent from its past that then launches this subject as a superject into the future, where it will become an object for the next concrescence to inherit. Yeah.
And I'll freeze frame that right now because I don't think there's any more animation. So this is a beautiful summary, excuse me, of what is otherwise a very challenging read and process in reality. And so for folks like myself, if you're curious and you want to discover this, that these and other lectures by Matthew on his channel are a great place to start. And if you can work with this and get familiar with this, then the book becomes more easily. I haven't gone back into the book yet. As I said to Matthew before we started, I got about halfway through and then I ran for help. So, and this is a great place to go. And my running for help isn't saying anything at all. I have no academic background. I'm not an intellectual, and so I'm just very essence of an average person, and but it is apprehendable, and so I will say that too. If you're curious and you want to know about philosophy and metaphysics, that this is doable. You can get through this, and it's very rewarding. It's rich because it does satisfy some of our questions about reality and the nature of reality. So I'll go ahead and stop the share, and we'll bring ourselves back here. I'll get my screen back up so I can see you fully now.
Yeah.
So there's one thing that's not been discussed yet, and that's the G word. That's the God aspect of this, important aspect of this treatise, or this scheme. So can you talk to me about how this is a very unique take on God? So to set the stage, you just, I think you mentioned panentheism. Was it pantheism or panentheism earlier? Is it
Panentheism,
panentheist?
yeah,
Okay.
would be closer to Whitehead's point of view than pantheism. Yeah.
Pantheism. Okay, so that's where we start for folks in the audience, that you can think about panentheism. No, I'm not going to say Spinoza's God, but just, yeah, I'm trying to get an invocation here to start with for people. But anyway, I don't need to prime. They'll figure out from what you're saying. So the God aspect of this scheme.
Right. So in some ways, because Whitehead, as a metaphysician, did make reference to God, and it's a metaphysician's God, it's not a God of, it's not a religious God, though it can be that secondarily. For Whitehead, it was primarily to bring coherence to his metaphysical scheme that he made reference to a God concept. In some ways, this allowed his philosophy to be preserved by the process theologians who took it up for
Okay.
the second half of the 20th century, and continued to develop it and think with it and kept his books in print. But on the other hand, you could say that because of the direction that philosophy went, in addition to the difficulty of Whitehead's philosophy and the disfavor that metaphysics as such fell into with the rise of logical positivism and analytic approaches to philosophy, most academic philosophers were pretty much methodologically atheist, if not metaphysically atheist. And so, when they would see that Whitehead's bringing God in, they'd be like, okay, this is obsolete, right? We've moved on. But Whitehead's understanding of God is an attempt to solve a metaphysical problem. And so Aristotle is mentioned by Whitehead as someone who brought in God to solve a metaphysical problem, which was the source of motion. Aristotle's unmoved mover was his attempt to give an explanation for sort of the first cause of the motion of the heavens and everything else, right? And Whitehead says that this was based on a faulty physics. We have a deeper understanding of motion now in light of modern physics. And so we don't need the prime mover anymore. But we do need, there's an analogous problem that is raised by quantum physics, which is how does something actual come out of possibility? Mm-hmm. How do you get an actual world out of what we could call the quantum vacuum, right? And so for Whitehead, this is an analogous problem, and he brings in a concept of God as what he calls the principle of limitation, or the principle of concretion, which is an explanation for how you could say how you get something from nothing, where nothing is this sort of plenum of infinite energy that's just still in the state of pure potential. How does that become anything actual? Well, Whitehead says God. Now, God's role here is to function as a kind of initial limit, or you could say the initial conditions that set the tone for the further course of cosmic evolution. They allow something, they allow this realm of infinite possibility to be given a definite character. And so Whitehead will talk about the primordial nature of God is the evaluation, or the envisagement is a word he uses, of this infinite realm of possibilities or eternal objects, giving them some order, which is then inherited by all the subsequent occasions of experience, and provides what Whitehead says, that God's primordial ordering of the realm of possibility provides each subsequently concressing actual occasion some sense of relevant novelty. If finite creatures like you and I were exposed to the unfiltered plenum of possibilities in each moment, Whitehead thinks it would be pretty overwhelming. We wouldn't
Yeah,
know what to do with ourselves, right?
sure.
So
I
God's kind of the reducing valve, or the
Okay.
filter that gives relevant novelty, not determining what we decide to do or how we decide to interpret our experience, but giving us some hint or filter or some sense of relevance for what would be most beautiful to do, to decide to do, or how to interpret our experience. And so this is the role of the primordial nature of God. And then, because God is an actual entity, God is a creature in Whitehead's scheme, a creature of creativity,
Mhm.
is how he puts it. God also has two poles, just like each concrescence has a physical and a mental pole. God also has a physical and a mental pole. The only difference with God is that they're reversed. So the
Mhm.
primordial nature is God's mental pole, dealing only with the realm of possibility. God's consequent nature is God's physical pole, which is what is responsive to all the decisions of the actual occasions that are made in the course of cosmic history. And so God's consequent nature is feeling everything that happens and grows with everything that happens. And in some way that is somewhat mysterious, the primordial and the consequent poles are part of one God. So even though the primordial pole is described as this eternal envisagement of the realm of possibility, it's held in sort of dialectical tension with the consequent nature, which is historical and which participates with the experience of all the creatures of the cosmos, and is growing as it absorbs those experiences, and suffering with and enjoying with us the nature of experience. And so there's a historical kind of emergent God, the consequent pole, and then there's this primordial eternal God, the primordial pole. Somehow they're one God. This is mysterious. Whitehead admitted, I'm asked. This is a metaphor
Yeah,
appealing for an imaginative leap, right?
right, right. You got to have mystery in the story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But unlike traditional theisms where God's role is to kind of wield the thunder as the all-powerful father figure who can reach in and manipulate nature and cause miracles and do all these things,
Sure.
intervening in the course of nature, that's not a role that God can play in Whitehead's cosmos.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
God's not all powerful. God knows everything it's possible to know, but not even God knows the future, because the future hasn't happened yet. Right? That's
Hmm.
up to creatures to decide as they concress in each moment. Yeah, inheriting what Whitehead calls an initial aim from God, but not being determined by God's initial aim. So God's not all powerful. God's not all knowing in the sense of knowing the future.
Hmm.
Um, and God's not responsible for evil in this case. There's the problem of evil theodicy
The Odyssey, yeah.
that traditional theologians struggle with. Why would a good, loving God allow so
Hmm.
much suffering? Um, in Whitehead's scheme, well, God's not all powerful, and so evil is more a function of the nature of creativity in a finite world. And in order for there to be creative advance, there must also be perpetual perishing,
Hmm.
right? And so the
Hmm.
fact that the past can be lost and forgotten is for Whitehead a great evil. And all God can do is in the consequent pole of God, the function of the consequent pole is to remember as a kind of cosmic memory
Hmm.
that in some way ameliorates some of the evil, but there's still this suffering that results from loss, the
Sure.
death of loved ones, etc. So that's the theological aspect of Whitehead's thought.
That was a good explanation. And so I'll ask a couple of questions, and I'm glad you brought up the theodicy because the the spontaneity of being, I think, has, kind of a cost benefit. Improvising our reality or our action in reality is trial and error. Our experiential agency, if it were preordained or predestined, what's the point of the exercise, especially if there's an omnipotent, omniscient, as you said, a transcendent skyfather figure? What's the point? So I think this is more elegant and more, it shows this God agency, if I can say that, in a better light. And so I guess that I just spilled out a question. Is this an agency of a processorial agency of sort that just flows with this this process essentially? There's agency to it if it can learn and preserve what you and I go through in life, and when we perish, there's a preservation of what was experienced and learned by these probes or agencies that feel and act. So I always look at it like we're behaving on behest of something, of X, and or at the behest or the behalf of that, and so it has that, as you said a moment ago, that capacity to retain the experience and perhaps the lesson. That's kind of a bad word, but what was learned, I guess, in experience.
Yeah. I mean, the divine learns as a result of the decisions that creatures make.
Okay.
And in Whitehead's view, God does have a kind of agency, um, in the sense that it is God that lures us toward what is most beautiful. But Whitehead says the power of God is the worship that God inspires, right? And so, in some way, he doesn't want to separate the agency of God from the agency of creatures in response to God.
Mm-hmm.
God's power is the worship that God inspires, and if that inspiration doesn't take hold, God's power is kind of mute, right? Creatures need to respond to these divine lures, um, to give God agency, as it were. Okay. So God needs the world just as much as the world needs God in Whitehead's scheme. There's a sort of call and response between the two, and there are some who want to inherit Whitehead's thought and do away with God and with eternal objects as well, and just have actual occasions relating to other actual occasions, and creativity. And I think that, I encourage experimentation with metaphysics, but I think Whitehead's scheme doesn't make as much sense anymore if you remove eternal objects and God, because Whitehead felt that the fact that our cosmos is as ordered and beautiful as it is, not that it's pure order, clearly there's chaos too, but the fact that order, to the extent that we detect it, has emerged out of chaos, he thinks this begs for some sort of an account of the source of this order, right? Why is the universe so clearly on a complexifying arc?
Mm-hmm.
And while there are better and worse ways to bring theology into your cosmology, you don't want to interfere with the search for scientific causes. And I think Whitehead was very sensitive to the need to balance religious intuitions with scientific investigation, and not sort of unduly limit or dismiss science. He really wanted to acknowledge the significance of the scientific method and the importance of the freedom of scientific hypothesis formation, unencumbered by theological dogmas or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, in Whitehead's historical account of the emergence of science, he says, look, if it wasn't for the theological context in Europe and sort of medieval scholasticism and the refinement of rationality provided by this tradition, the early scientists never would have even considered that nature might be so highly ordered and mathematical, right? So this image of God as a kind of engineer or mathematician who was very much concerned with the logic and the rationality of every little causal interaction in the natural world. I mean, this inspired science,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you see this coming through clearly in figures like Descartes and Newton,
Mm-hmm.
who were deists. And Whitehead thinks without the deistic or theistic motivations, science never would have, modern science as we know it, never would have gotten off the ground, right? So he's looking for a new relationship between science and religion that wouldn't be as antagonistic as it has become.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think hopefully the culture wars will subside and we'll begin to be able to have a new kind of conversation in light of the kind of work that Whitehead's doing to integrate science and religion, because I don't think we can have a functioning worldview and a coherent account of the cosmos and our place within it, without some kind of a God concept,
Yeah.
um, some kind of sense of what is ultimate, what's the source, what's the first cause. These are questions that we're gonna always be left with, and I don't think it's coherent to just say nope, it all happened on accident, and
Yeah.
we're randomly here and aren't really lucky.
Yeah, it seems like if you're going to make a couple of moves and you're not going to embrace nihilism and what physicalism at its worst can present in that sense, that you have to make some kind of Bayesian inference or some kind of Bayesian move that you have this, but we have an unknown variable that you can form it how you wish. But I think the way he did it is elegant. And I think so. Initially, my knee jerk to hearing the word God in a metaphysical scheme is very direct, and it's almost like, what's the cost benefit on introducing that term in, and the divine as well. I'll say that because I consider myself a very like skeptical, but not cynical, like skeptical and just asking questions and never wanting to pretend like I know anything. I just continuously asking questions. So I'm asking a Whitehead at this point, what was the cost benefit on bringing the idea of God in? But I see one side benefit at least, or maybe it was fully intended, is to have the preservation, like you said, in with the theologians, to keep it till the time was sort of there, or conditions lined up so that it could be brought out and utilized in an academic sense, and in a union with science, perhaps, which would be the ultimate goal. So yeah, that was one of my questions: is did he think that through, that he might, in the face of the emergence of postmodernism and, like you said, logical positivism and all the things that were going on in the early 20th century? Well, postmodernism happened a little later, I guess, but just what has been emerging in philosophy lately, that, and even in physics and the sort of, physics is, a lot of physicists tend to go by the metaphysics of physicalism. So he obviously had to think that through, right? That he was making that move, bringing that strong of a term. And so in other words, he could have gone more like with Advaita Vedanta and said, the Maya, not necessarily Maya, the Brahman, or, something in that, but give his own term to it. I just can't help but think he had to really think that one through, right? Or was he just, I know his father was a clergyman, so maybe that was personal to him and maybe that had some resonance. So straighten me out, straighten me out on that. Cause that's like, you're making a bold move with putting that into the metaphysics, even though it's a necessity. And I completely agree.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I rambled again.
It's an important question. Whitehead's father and grandfather were clergymen
Okay.
and educators. They ran a religious school. Actually, Whitehead is descended from George Whitehead, the Quaker sort of
Oh,
religious freedom fighter
oh,
from the 17th century. And so um, he has this religious lineage and was himself more religious in his youth and kind of turned away from the church. I think around, certainly before the First World War, or if not because of the First World War.
mm,
He lost his son, who was in the Royal Air Force, who was shot down over France, I believe, and so he wasn't overtly religious in the latter part of his life in the sense that he attended church or anything. And there are some lectures that he gave, like there's a lecture he gave on um, Augustine, and he's very critical of Augustine.
okay.
And religious dogma and the role that it plays in the motivations for religious violence and whatnot. He had no patience for
Okay.
that. He had no patience for visions of the divine as some kind of a dictator who is large and in charge. So he's very critical of Orthodox religion. Nonetheless, he was a romantic at heart, and I think the English romantics, Wordsworth in particular, was probably, aside from Plato, his most important influence. And
Okay.
so he was predisposed to this sort of pantheist or panentheist, really, way of thinking about God's relationship to the natural world. And so he clearly had um, religious feelings, or nowadays maybe we would say spiritual but not religious
Mm-hmm.
feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this whole kind of aesthetic and moral side to his philosophy, in addition to the logical rigor of the categories of the metaphysical scheme. He wanted to do justice to his own intuitions about the divine ground of nature, which he felt people who are sensitive experience directly,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't need to be a brilliant nature poet like Wordsworth to appreciate the beauty of a sublime natural scene, a great waterfall, or even just a sunset over the ocean or something. There seems to be a purpose or a meaning or a beauty that's shining through these types of experiences, which is calling out for philosophical interpretation beyond just, oh, our organism happened to be naturally selected. I mean, appreciating beauty seems like it would might get you killed if natural Darwinian natural
Maladaptive.
selection. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty.
Um, yeah.
Splat.
So he thought there was something else going on here.
Okay. And that, yeah, and that makes sense. There's a lot of that I think we could take, neo-Dar, or yeah, I guess it's neo-Darwinism can't work some of that out. They try to explain empathy and compassion, and yeah, there's obviously pro-adaptive signaling there, but I just think, yeah, there's some things that sterile approach can't, and you can still preserve adaptation and evolution. I mean, it's there, but to interpret it a little more elegantly. And that's one thing I really appreciate about Whitehead's metaphysics is, as you've pointed out in your lectures, there's the eros, and there is the draw towards the aesthetic, the beauty, and in gravitating towards that. And so I know we've got about 20 minutes, and so this might just be a part 1 of 2, and I can bring you back in a time that's good for you, and we can keep going, because I really do want to talk some about the implications and some of the things that orbit around what influenced Whitehead, et cetera. So the psycho-spiritual, this is a deep one for like 20 minutes, but let's hit this one, and then we can come back for another conversation. The psycho-spiritual human nature, how does that fit with Whitehead's metaphysics, with the animation that we just saw? Our human nature, our psyche, if you will, to get Jungian for a moment. Did he put some of that in, some thought into that, and did he talk about that in other of his writings about our psychic nature? I don't mean like psychical nature, I guess.
Right. Um, there's not much in the way of a developed psychology in Whitehead's work, though I think it's easy enough to turn to James for that,
Okay.
which is such an important influence on Whitehead. Certainly William James's most famous work, Varieties of Religious Experience, which shifted the conversation away from sort of systematic theology to the experiential domain, mystical experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of trying to prove the existence of God through the tools of logic, which occupied theologians for thousands of years,
Mm-hmm.
James was like, okay, let's look at this from a psychological perspective. What sorts of experiences are people having that lead them to believe, despite the evidence against the idea of God? It seems that human beings, while we do have logical and rational faculties, we're also beings driven by our passions, our emotions,
Mm-hmm.
our desires, our intuitions. And mystical experiences are overpowering in their influence on those who are graced with them. Um, Nowadays, well, I think already, for going looking at Vedic traditions and Buddhist traditions, there are breathing techniques and meditation forms of meditation that can possibly help elicit these sorts of experiences. So they don't just necessarily always have to happen randomly, though.
Hmm.
There are also plenty of accounts of people with no prior aesthetic training or meditative practice, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden just yeah, just have this experience befall them.
Yeah.
um, and it can be pretty shocking, as it seems you're aware.
Yeah, it blew my mind. And I was actually meditating, but I wasn't a good meditator. I didn't have any hours under my belt. And I was in a conference center, and the music was really loud, and the guy leading a meditation. And, I got into just a relaxed state. And all of a sudden I got hit by this blast of the only thing I could say is like a burnt orange light that was strobing extremely high hertz, right? And it blew me away. And the best thing I can say was a braingasm, just like superior to physical orgasm, just incredible. And I was not worried in the least, but like I was having like this is that stroke that you get a nice show before the hemorrhaging, you bleed out or whatever. This was more just, it was ecstatic in a sense, if I could use that's a strong word, but I was laughing and crying at the same time. And I just thought, wow, this is great. I got my money's worth at this meditation conference that I went to. This is great. But I was just, it didn't shift my trajectory because I was already on kind of a quest trajectory, but it was impactful. So I'm sorry to go off on a
Right,
tangent about
right.
that,
Yeah, no, thanks for
but
sharing
no,
that.
yeah, it was profound, and I wasn't looking for it. I just wanted to get calm and do what I was being told to do. There was a little breath work involved, but I wasn't doing the breath work. I just calmed myself and pow, whatever that was.
Right.
So,
For James, it was a little bit of nitrous oxide that did the trick.
mm, okay,
Um, he understood the significance of mystical experience in the history of religion. He says as a result of his nitrous oxide experiences, and he says he understood the idealistic philosophy of Hegel better,
oh,
having had this experience of mystical unity with all things.
okay,
Um, I don't know that Whitehead ever he doesn't write about his own experience with anything
mm,
psychedelic, as we would call it nowadays. He seems to have been a pretty sober person. He
okay,
was even, as the British say, a teetotaler for some time.
okay,
Um, and so Whitehead's experience of mystical consciousness seems to have come mostly through reading poetry. That would be
okay,
my guess. Um, but this certainly the psychology of religion and religious experience, I think, is really informing Whitehead's vision of the role of the divine in not only in human life but cosmologically. That God works primarily through feeling and intuition, and we can do our best to conceptually understand that process, but that ultimately, without the experiential component, none of our conceptual reflection is going to make any sense, right?
yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. I didn't know that about James, but yeah, I think and poetry is perfectly valid because I think, and when you look at the mystics of the Middle Ages, like Marguerite Poiret or any of those, they talk about these, what I would grant them as being these bona fide mystical experiences, whatever they are. And it's basically getting out of your own way. It's basically getting lost in something. So Sufis will dance, and others will chant, others will breathe, others will dance all night, others will take iboga or whatever, But I think something as simple and subtle as just getting lost in a good piece of literature. And it seems like the philosophers of the period that you work with talk about the arts and the aesthetics. Like Schopenhauer talks about the arts, and that is our one way of connecting to a higher sort of transcendent expression,
Yeah,
perhaps. So yeah, I'm totally open to that.
yeah. Schelling, who I start my book with, goes so far as to say that it is art that picks up where philosophy leaves off in its pursuit of what he calls the absolute. Um, Philosophy can, Schelling says, conceptually approach uh, the the nature of absolute being or absolute consciousness, if you want, but it can only get there sort of subjectively in the sense that it's thinking about the absolute, whereas the artist can, through whatever their medium of expression is, actually bring into objective reality through a poem, through a painting or a sculpture or a beautiful musical
Mm.
composition, can
Mm-hmm.
bring the absolute sort of into actual being,
Mm-hmm.
so that we're with, all of a sudden we're inside of it through our appreciation of the artwork. And so he gives art actually pride of place above philosophy in the realization of the absolute. And
Okay.
the absolute in the German idealist context is just another word for God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think we underestimate the power of imagination. And so I think most people's first reaction of imagination is a 4-year-old that sees, unicorns or whatever. But I think if a well-developed imagination is where we get a lot of novel creation in this world. So we are kind of not, we're not a, we emulate what I think is the process that Whitehead describes in our own right. We do emulate simulation a lot and simulacra and things like that, but we also emulate that creative process, that pulling down of the eternal objects can happen. I think not maybe obliquely, but just I think so. I like to look at patterns in behavior and patterns in the world that might reflect what the mystery is, what is going on in that mysterious sense. So I always like to think of the imagination as being something worth developing, and it doesn't have to be silly. And I mean, you could be like a pataphysicist and go off and do weird, surreal things, and that's always fun too. But to take it seriously, like you would a meditation practice or even a devotional practice, not to that degree, but to some extent. Let me ask you one question, and I know again we're running up against time, and I may be overstating the obvious here because again I'm not a educated person, but it seems like that if we look at our innate selves, and other philosophers have pointed out the will to believe, the will to power, the will to sex, the will to meaning, all these different things. And so, the will to spirit seems like, chief among those, or should be among those, that regardless of what how you come up in life, or there just seems to be this innate drive to have either a will to spirit or will to regalia or something, seeking of a transcendence. And so somebody who could be somewhat of a physicalist or maybe an atheist, but there's that vacuum seems to fill somehow. They still have this kind of expression in their lives that fits those archetypes, if you will, of spiritual behavior. So is that a good intuition that I think all of us possess that in our nature?
I think so. I think the human being is unique among mammals in that, we're not determined by our instinctual inheritance. And so we sort of come into the world open to possibility. And we need to realize who and what we are through our own will. And we're helped by community and culture to do that, of course.
Right.
But there's this real sense of self transcendence that comes into the living world with the human being, and the religious instinct is a function of this self transcendence, and is this need for um, an explanation and a some sense of you know resolution of this feeling that we have. You could call it wonder or amazement, um, that anyone who just stops to reflect on the sheer fact that they exist, it's going to produce a religious feeling, a spiritual feeling, a mystical feeling, whatever word you want to use for it. And how we respond to that feeling, I think, is that's where culture is born. That's where meaning is made. And we get into linguistic difficulties here because of the words that different people of different temperaments will choose to describe this type of experience. And I think often we neglect the extent to which the feeling is universal, because of the idiosyncratic ways that different cultural groups have languaged the feeling and built up whole schemes of thought around the feelings. And so I really feel like we're in need of more kind of inter-religious dialogue, and including atheism as a kind of religious response to these sorts of feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Even nihilism. Like if you're a nihilist, it's like you're aware of these feelings that come up, but instead of sort of following them forward, you say, nope, that's an illusion,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's delusion, or that's if we go down that road and fan the flames of this religious instinct, the atheist or the nihilist worries that it just always leads to bad things.
Sure.
It can, for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but again, I feel like it leads to bad things because we mistake the words for the reality of the
Right.
experience.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And we tend to in post Enlightenment project take very literally things that were not intended to be taken literally. So fundamentalism, I think, arises from that, and that a rethinking of that is in order, especially in the West. The East has a lot of that under wraps or taken care of, I think. But I'm also optimistic, because if I could be, wave a magic wand and make one thing happen, it would be a second reformation of Christianity. And I don't identify as a Christian. In fact, if I want to play semantic shuffle, I firstly identify as an atheist, but then I'm a pantheist leaning person. So I'm a nun in a sense that I'm wide open, but I call it a mystery, right? I don't want to pretend like I know anything, but I would
Right.
love to see that. And I see people emerging. Again, that's where Rupert Sheldrake is very inspirational, in that he talks to like this John Butler is sort of, and they tend to fall into this category of like a non-dual Catholic. I interviewed a guy who's United Church of Christ minister, and he is in this same league. And so I think and Thomas Merton was a great example in the 60s of this sort of enlightened Christian. And I would love, love, love to see that spring up and take hold, as well as the other aspects of Abrahamic belief. Within Islam, to see, but Sufism seems to address that to a degree. They like Ibn Arabi and people like that tend to invoke Neoplatonism and other things, and filter it through, again, adhering and respecting and being devotional to Islam, but nonetheless saying it's more than just fundamentalism, and it's more than just the word, right? Which again, the word can be taken literally. So I'm optimistic that there are people endeavoring. Richard Rohr is a good example of a Catholic. I think he's Jesuit or Benedictine, and just a great example of that. So anyway, I'm sorry I'm rambling again, but I just that's one of my aspirations in my time on this earth, is to explore that and work with people to realize a more humane, a more ethical means of navigating experience, and bringing that to our descendants, and bringing that to the next generation, the next filial that come along, because what they're dealing with now, I'm 52, and it concerns me what's going on. So that's why, again, I gravitate to people like you, and I'm familiar with Bernardo Kastrup. I think his intentions are spectacular as far as doing this, and his Essentia Foundation, which is interesting because I mentioned Ian McGilchrist earlier, and he's now on board. It's got a lot of interesting guys. He and Fred Matzers have a lot of interesting guys in that group. So things like that give me some hope, and the work that you're doing gives me hope and makes me feel better when I lay my head down at night, knowing that we have a way, and we have the sobriety and the clarity available. If it can we just got to figure out how to hook it, right? We got to get marketing on this, right? We got to become marketing, not me, but I mean, guys like you need to, not saying I'm laying this on you, but just what is the way to relevance, I guess, and salience. I'm now sounding like Vervaeke, but it's like, how do we? And he's working with a great group of people. I really admire his work too, and the Rebel Wisdom people. I mean, there are good actors out there, I think, with good intentions that are trying to sort this all out. So helps me sleep at night.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot of great stuff happening, and really amen to everything you were just saying. it's desperately needed now, and because we need human beings need motivation for to continue the project of civilized existence.
Hmm.
It's not a given. It just doesn't happen automatically, you
Yeah.
know. And so I think philosophy, the love of wisdom, science, religion, the arts, we have all of these different domains for cultivating experience that are so important. And, you know, the internet is kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that it gives, the marketers more tools to manipulate
Mm.
eros,
Hmm.
but it also gives all of us more avenues for connecting and trying to cultivate a genuine sense of response to the divine call or to the aesthetic lures that are shaping and have been
Hmm.
shaping cosmic evolution for billions of years, and if we want to participate, we'll continue to shape it in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Matthew, I think that's a wonderful place to hit pause. And I know you have commitments coming up time-wise. So why don't we stop here? And an open invitation. You can come back because there's stuff I want to go and talk about. And it includes physics like second law of thermodynamics and entropy. And also we brought up Vervaeke. So there was one thing I wanted to ask you that I will in the second part is like he calls himself a non-reductive physicalist. And I almost think there's a glimpse of like he can say that through the lens of process relational metaphysics, possibly. When I
Okay.
look at supervenience and causal downward causation, and so trying to just unpack that with my little mind, it seems like that's what he might be inferring. So, but we can touch on that. I want to touch on ethics and what we were just sort of working with. And so, if you're okay with that, I'll bring you back. And
Yeah.
to those in the audience that are still here, should we mention that there's likely going to be a conversation between you and Bernardo Castro, and that is something that I'm looking forward to, and I'm very deeply grateful that I can be a host in that and be present for that and live. So
Yeah.
I've reached out to him and he did say yes, and so I'm just we're going to set up some times and dates, and so we'll see that. So for
Great.
those of you, this is your reward that stuck around for the full hour and 10 minutes. I always appreciate the folks. You can see on your analytics like you got like 8%
Yeah.
retention, and I'm like, you guys rock, you guys are the best.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
much love to you
Yeah.
guys too. And so Matthew, this has been a beautiful conversation. And again, I spoke to you before we hit record that my intention is to generate accessibility of this material and other material and talking to other people, other great minds. And so I appreciate you doing that and walking us through it in a way that I know people can work with and hopefully inspire some curiosity if people are coming cold calling this video and don't know the first thing about Whitehead, that they can start here. Plenty of stuff on Whitehead out there, especially on your channel. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to have all the relevant links to your channel, your Twitter feed, and your website. And we'll see what happens. And I wish this conversation well when it enters the YouTube stream, the
Yeah.
grand collective consciousness that's YouTube now.
Yeah.
So yeah, the YouTube verse. So Zuck has his metaverse and YouTube has its sort of info verse. Yeah, good,
Right.
bad, and ugly,
Yeah.
like you said, right? So
Yeah. We'll send it out and it'll do battle with the algorithms, and
yeah,
we'll see what
yeah,
happens. But
yeah. It'll
it's been a really fun conversation and just the beginning. I
Yes.
look forward to more.
I would love a part two because we laid some groundwork here, and then to move forward from that groundwork for me and for what I would hope for the audience would be fruitful and fulfilling. So I will petition that of you, and we'll see what we can do. And then, like I said, hopefully forthcoming, there will be a conversation between Matt and Bernardo, and I'm sure that will be really neat. So I'll say goodbye to you off after we hit stop record, and I will thank again the attendees, people who are watching this. Viewers, thank you so much for participating in this conversation with myself and Professor Segall. So, all right, Matthew, I'll stop recording and then I'll say goodbye to you on the other side.